Dr. Collier, thank you so much for being here. And I appreciate the whole panel, and I hope we're all ready to soak in what our panel is going to bring to us tonight.
Okay.
So Walter, take it away.
Thank you, Laurel, and thank you, teammates. Welcome everybody who is listening and watching. We're going to begin with a very short encapsulated historical view. And as Laurel just mentioned, that is really meant just to set the theme, to give us some context. But in so doing, I want to make two statements. One, those viewers who are white, what I'm about to say, you should not take it as I'm beating you over the head or damning you or doing all kinds of terrible things to you. It is simply being done just so we know where we're going. For Black viewers, I know you've heard this because you've lived through it. So I don't mean to preach to the choir, but once again, we want to start somewhere. And it's important that we start with the history so that we know where we're expected to end up. And we expect to end up at a point where we have some concrete strategies and actions for people to take away with and to use them in their own lives and in their communities. So let me begin with the foundation of racism, and that is the concept of race, which is a pseudo concept. It was made up by European scientists. It has no scientific basis at all. There is no definitive correlation between the amount of melanin you have in your skin and your intelligence or your character or your morality or any of those things. It really was developed because it served the purpose of the burgeoning capitalism in Europe. It was a way for capitalism to justify their exploitation of people, of free labor, slave labor, and for them and the people supporting them not to feel guilty, not to feel that they were doing something immoral. After all, the narrative went, well, these people don't know much, they're uncivilized, they need us, and so we might as well use them for our benefit. Fast forward to America. The system of exploitation and slave labor really got codified. It really got institutionalized in such a way that racism could simply be defined as an inhuman, unjust, and egregious treatment of people by another group simply based on their color. And so we begin there. I'm going to also fast forward to the present, and it'll give you an idea of the history as I do so. In the beginning, in the days of the plantation, of course, slaves were not allowed to vote. They had no voice. They weren't allowed to read. They weren't allowed to be educated, and therefore they could not vote really with any kind of sense of knowing what they were doing. 400 years ago, right? Okay, here we are in the 21st century, and there is a systematic effort being made even now to disenfranchise Blacks from voting, to take away their rights for voting, to take away the power that comes with the ability to vote. Going back to the plantation, families were broken up, sisters were sold, brothers were sold off, mothers and fathers were sold off to make sure that no family structure developed, because out of a family structure develops identity and strength, and that is not something that the slave owners wanted to happen. And so we come to the 21st century. Mass incarceration has done more to break up Black families probably than what was done on the plantations in the South. Families have been destroyed, decimated, splintered, and it's caused all kinds of difficulties for the children as well as for that parent who fortunately was not incarcerated. Black people suffer all kinds of disparities because of this system of racism. What's particularly on our minds nowadays is COVID-19. When according to CDC, Blacks are 4 times more likely to be hospitalized because of infection and over 3 times more likely to die. And what COVID has done is pull the covers back and it illustrates the many, many medical problems that African Americans have that just exacerbates the problems that are brought about by the virus itself. And it's really is a naked and candid illustration of the lack of access that Blacks have to quality health care and the resulting fact that they suffer a lot, much more than whites do, from chronic diseases, diabetes, emphysema, you name it, and we seem to be at the top of the list when it comes to that. When it comes to just trying to do well in terms of living, we earn less than probably any other group in the country. Taking into account education, the average annual income for whites is about $67,000 a year. For Blacks, it's 41, which is hardly enough to support a family of 4 or more. But nonetheless, we have strived to try to narrow that disparity. And as time goes on, as we all know, the gap just seems to widen. And it does so with the intent of making sure that Blacks have a difficulty or never are able to catch up in terms of wealth quality or income quality. Looking at some other things, going back to the plantation, you know, the slave catchers, as they were called, did their jobs to make sure that Blacks didn't run away. And if they did run away, they could be hung, they could be castrated, but they did undergo very, very egregious punishment. Fast forward to the 21st century. There are more Blacks incarcerated in the United States than can be believed. There are over 1 million people incarcerated in prisons. I'm excluding jails. And the overwhelming majority of them are people of color, especially Blacks. So the slave cops, I guess you could call them, are still out there, still doing their job. And related to criminal justice, it is very rare, if it ever happens at all, that a white man for a traffic stop is shot in the back or shot in the head or hung, or a white woman. Rarely. Rarely is a white woman ever stopped with her kids in her car and forced to get out of the car and lay on the ground, including a 6-year-old child, for mistaken identity. I believe the supposed charge was theft of an automobile, but they laid on the ground for over 2 hours. So these are just examples of what African Americans and other people of color have to endure. I mean, the statistics go on and on and on. I mean, Black business owners are very, very, very rarely able to get a business loan from the bank compared to a white entrepreneur who could walk into a bank and easily get a loan.
Yeah.
So everything is clearly color-coded. And the history in that respect has not changed a whole lot, even though we are 400 years away. And so this is what we're dealing with. These are some of the realities. Another reality, which is very much a part of the history, is the miseducation of whites. While they benefit greatly in terms of socioeconomic privileges and what have you, they have been miseducated in terms of this thing called whiteness. It's taken on a life of itself as if it means something, as if it has some kind of substance, and it doesn't. And when I find in my own experience, and I'm sure that's true for many of the people who are listening as well as those on the panel, when you explain to a white person the history of something and how it came about, or the fact that this was invented by a Black person or a Black person was responsible for this, they are shocked and amazed and surprised. And they say, well, I never knew that. Well, it's because in order for the system of racism to work, white people have to be miseducated. They have to be convinced that Black people do not deserve to receive the privileges that they receive. They have to be convinced that they are intellectually inferior. They have to be convinced that they have no morals. They have to be convinced that they're dangerous in order for the system to work. And as a result, a lot of white people are angry, disappointed, maybe confused that they have been denied these truths all these years. And they find themselves in a situation where they dislike or bias against or even hate people without cause and without any justification. These are just some of the complexities and realities that are involved in this rather formative problem that we call racism. And these are some of the issues that this panel over our series for the month of February hopes to address and to more specifically come up with concrete strategies and actions that the viewers can use in joining us in trying to do something about this problem. We are at a point in our history in this country where it is an opportune time to do something, to do better. And I fear if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, of this particular time, God knows where this country will end up. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn the mic back over to Laurel. And I hope that you stay with us through the whole series, and I'm sure you will derive a lot of benefit out of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. Amazing words and amazing background as we do traverse some uncomfortable territory for a lot of people. So again, I just want everybody to feel brave and to open your hearts and your minds. And if you hear something, write it down and just meditate on it. I'm going to open the discussion, and we are going to have a Q&A at the end. Again, keep track of your questions, send them to MVYRADIO. There you'll find the MVYRADIO host, and you send them directly to that chat, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And we have a surprise for you at the end as well that will leave you feeling really, really wonderful. So I would like to pose a question, a tough one, to each panel member. It might be a little unfair because there's so many things you could hone in on, but if you could each hone in on one important reality that we need to recognize and understand and face in order to make meaningful change. Tiffany, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I knew you were going to do that. Walter really took a lot of what I had to say. I really believe that to just choose the reality of our history, right? I think sometimes in this country, we do not like to recognize or acknowledge the history of this country. I hear a lot of people use language like, oh, this doesn't happen here, or this isn't America. And I think until we can acknowledge that these things do happen here, and this is the America we've lived in, that our ancestors have been brought here and have lived in, we can't make the change that we want. Until we recognize and acknowledge what has happened in the past and what's continuously happening now, we won't be able to make real change in the future. So I believe like the acknowledgement of our history in this country will allow us to have a better future.
So Tiffany, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think that there are so many ways we can do that, but do you have some suggestions on how we can do that? Just to throw out some tools for our kit?
Yeah, I think the first thing is like learning your history. Walter is completely right when he talks about there has been a lot of miseducation. And I would even challenge the people of color in the room to say, you have also been miseducated as well. It's not just white people who have been miseducated. And I think everyone in America, like everyone in the world, learning your history and being committed to that growth, that personal growth is really important. And I think that's where it starts. It starts with you like dismantling the white supremacy culture, the culture that's within yourself, to continue to like make change. And so if I had to say like the first thing that comes to my mind of like what we can do is education. Educate yourself on the history. Educate yourself on your history. It wasn't until I went to get educated that I was able to tell people, like, I am Black excellence. I am Black royalty. My melanin is popping. Like, I love myself. I love being Black. But that wasn't taught to me in school. And so I believe that, like, if you really want to make change in this country, and you really want to make change, go learn about the history. Because until we can acknowledge what has happened, we won't be able to move forward.
And that brings to mind checking where we're getting our history and getting as much from different sources as you possibly can, and speaking to people who know. Thank you for that, Tiffany. I know we'll want to elaborate more with that. So thank you very much for that. Let's go to Michael. Michael, what do you feel is one of the important realities we need to recognize, understand, and face in order to make meaningful change?
Well, I do think that my comments are complementary to those of Tiffany and Walter and you. So it doesn't supplant it in any way, but I think grows out of it. For me, I think one of the great insights is that as we climb this mountain of race, that we need to remember that as climbers, we are truly roped together, that we are interdependent to one another, and not just for success to reach the summit, but also for just survival. And I think it's helpful, in this metaphorical approach to things, is that that when you are roped together and you are dependent on one another, you tend to root for not just yourself, but your teammates a little more. So I think this acknowledgement that as difficult as some of these issues are, and as long-standing and seemingly immovable, I think that it helps me approach these challenges by knowing that that I'm in it with Tiffany, and that her success is my success.
Well said. And I like the climbing reference. Michael McAuliffe is a, I don't even know if avid's the right word for it, mountain climber. He's climbed many of the big peaks out there. So another level of inspiration there. So that is really a powerful statement to make, that, when we consider each other as human beings and we are tethered together, helping each other, I hope that brings us all deeper into what we're trying to accomplish here tonight. So Clinton, what about you?
Well, I mean, I echo what Dr. Collier said and what Michael said, and certainly what Tiffany said. I'm a little bit more lasered about what that history looks like, what that truth looks like. I specifically, where it concerns Massachusetts, part of pulling back the layers is that Massachusetts has, in some respects, marketed itself as being sort of the epicenter of the abolition movement. Well, that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The reality is that Massachusetts was the original colony that legalized slavery. And a part of what Tiffany is talking about in terms of coming to terms with the truth is a part of that. We've not sold ourselves in that way. What we've told ourselves as being the epicenter for abolition. In the case of Martha's Vineyard, it's thought of certainly within the context of the Black community as being the playground for the Black elite, as being the place that people summer who are the Negro intelligentsia. But the reality is that the Spike Lees and the Skip Gates and the Michelles and Baracks and the Charlene Hunter Goltz and the Louis Sullivans, all of them stand on the shoulders of enslaved Africans who worked the fields in Chilmark all over that island. And so, that's the kind of story that we've got to tell. We tend to just market on what's sexy, but we got to really tell not just part of the truth, but the whole truth. And so that's what I would be pushing for in that way. And it's one of the reasons that, frankly, I found so egregious in some respects. Accuse me of being judgmental, if you will. But, the reality is that honoring, getting back to this whole issue that happened a couple of years ago, where concerned the Confederate plaques. Again, this was honoring somebody who wanted to preserve the institution of slavery, the very people who basically worked these fields on that island. And I thought that that was really adding insult to injury, which is one of the reasons that I took it so seriously. And so, yeah, I mean, I would echo what Dr. Collier said. I would echo what Tiffany said, what Michael said. It's about the history, but let's not be selective about that history. Let's tell the truth.
I see Tiffany snapping her fingers. Yes. Yeah. And that's part of the discomfort of having conversations like this, is that there's so much history that has been left untold and just overlooked. And we need to take a look at that history in order for us to really absorb what we're trying to change here in the world. So thank you for that very much, Glennon. Sandy, what do you feel is one of the single most important realities we need to recognize, understand, and face to make meaningful change?
Well, I thank you for having me. I didn't have a chance to say that, but thank you. After listening to my brother, Walter, Dr. Collier, and Tiffany, I realized that we have not come to where we are accidentally. And when you talk about the uncomfortable conversations, I think for me, I have my own journey in which I came from one place to the other. And I think that if we look at how we got here and what is the same from the time we started to where we are now, is that underneath it all, even though many of us are good people, we live in a society where white people believe that they're smarter and more beautiful and less violent and more trustworthy than others. And that is really the way we have been wired. And for the reality is, unless we're able as individuals, and many of us are in different places on that spectrum, to look introspectively into ourselves and acknowledge that, we're not going to be able to move forward. And I can give you just an example of my growing up. And when I grew up, and I'm older, this was in the 50s. I remember people worrying about a person moving into their neighborhood because the neighborhood would go down. There'd be drugs. The people that owned the houses would lose their financial base, and there would be drugs in the neighborhood. And it wasn't a subtle message. It was just there. And redlining was a perfect example of how that happened. And if any of us remember, those of us who are older, we remember that we never saw doctors and lawyers and intelligent people. All the people of color on television that we watched, and most of us were indoctrinated primarily from television. We saw people who were either criminals or subservient, or serving, and the most dignified of African American people were serving us. So these messages got inflicted on us for years and years. And I think these are the messages that we have to unwire. And this is how we need to think differently. And I think the language of we, as opposed to them and they, we are together as a team. I think some of us have gotten to the point where there is no more they and them, it's us. And that's where, as a society, we have to come to. So that's my take on it.
Thank you, Sandy. I appreciate that. And I wanted to just see, I've just been seeing some things go by in the chat, and I want to thank Dr. Lorna Andrade, because I've often had long conversations with her. She is an amazing woman who is active in this as well, saying that she's always said, we've got to go deep. We've got to go down deep to the truth, and we've got to, and she does it with a twinkle in her eye too. And I think of her, so as we are moving towards these conversations and unearthing a lot of this stuff, maybe for the first time for some of us, that we do again come to this with bravery and the ability to look at the real history here that everybody's bringing up and their own way of moving through that, and do it courageously and do it with an open intention. Because I think there's a lot for all of us to learn, and every day we're going to learn something new. But the truth is to dive in and do it and then go as deep as we can. So Peter, with your experience, this is
So the
you bring
formality of calling me Peter. Come on, Laurel, it's Pete.
Pete, I know. Peter, I'm going to wag my finger at you.
I always think I'm in trouble when you would call that. So
what's your middle name? I'll give you your middle name too.
No, I'm not going there because that'll give me away. It's Leroy, by the way. So,
Peter Leroy Ambrositis.
That's right. So my simple truth, and this is something I learned when I started doing this diversity work specifically about 20 years ago, is that bias is a human condition. It's a part of how we have gone through evolutionary times to be able to process 11 million bits of data per second in order to create shortcuts. Now, that's not an excuse for the behaviors that represents in our current society. So in the work that we do at Korn Ferry, we're helping client organizations that are all well-intended, or many are well-intended, that have not seen the impact of the investment of time, energy, and effort in creating what was called equality. Now, some of us may remember when that diversity stuff was all about having people become more tolerant of differences versus appreciating differences of all individuals. So when we think about the biases that exist because of our upbringing, because of the way our brains process information, everyone on this panel that are all well-intended individuals, we all have our biases. I have to check mine every day about my reaction to individuals. It happens in a split second. You hear someone talk, you see someone walking down the street, you make a decision whether you're going to smile or move away. When we're looking at client organizations, we're taking a look at all of their talent systems, from the recruiting and hiring processes to the development opportunities that are given to some, but not necessarily all, to those pay and reward systems. There's a lot of effort going on, but anyone on this panel can quote lots of statistics that still say, as Walter mentioned earlier, 60 cents on the dollar is what our Black colleagues are averaging across the United States alone, never mind globally. So that's part of what we need to talk about and identify. What are our biases? We all have a responsibility for checking those biases and make sure they're not impacting our behaviors. So that's my simple truth.
Thank you, Pete. I really appreciate that. I'm just laughing because I didn't put the R on the end of that. So the panel, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that we now, as a group here, we understand we all have a long way to go. We have a lot of history that we may know, and that just is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. We know how deep it goes. So again, I want to draw your attention to the people on the panel right now are going to be sharing links, which we'll put into our reference library at mvyradio.org/diversity. So you can go there, and a member of our MVY Radio governing board, Brenda Brathwaite, I want to thank her too for her hard work and also helping to build this reference library, because we do have to do that. We have to start somewhere. We have to get our education somewhere. And so we hope that this will lead you into this learning, this love for learning, this seeking that we all need to do right now inside of ourselves and with each other. So one of the things that I have been asked a lot about leading up to this panel is many people just have a discomfort with having conversations about this, even with people they know they can have a conversation with. So having a conversation with someone who is put up a wall isn't in the cards for them. So I'd love to ask the panel members to each give us like a tip or some sort of tool that we can use, something we can add to our action plan, because this is where we want to take this. We know there's a problem, and we need to now fix it. We need to activate ourselves and animate ourselves to change it. So what can we do as an action plan this first day, this first panel? Where can we go? Let's go back to Walter. What do you think, Walter? What's one thing that we can do right now that can change, make meaningful change out there in the world?
Well, first of all, and obviously to continue what we've started, to continue talking and being as open and as honest as we possibly can. And I think the more you talk about something in an honest kind of way, the less uptight people might feel. The more they hear that, oh, it's okay for me to talk about this and to use this word. I don't mean in a disparaging way, but to use certain language. Because I think speaking from the perspective, my perspective of dealing with white people or interacting with them, they are often walking on eggshells, not knowing what words to use or how to approach me or what to say. And I think the things that we can do to break down that kind of resistance, that wall, that barrier, is just to talk with each other more, one-on-one. Unfortunately, the virus that has just taken charge of our lives interrupted something that the Martha's Vineyard Diversity Coalition had planned to do. And that was a island-wide, let's get together and break bread kind of thing, where we would simply give ourselves a chance to know each other and to feel comfortable and to find out that, I'm not going to steal your daughter and you're not going to enslave me and all of these other things that may enter into our bias set. And I think coming together will do an awful lot, particularly since one of the basic pillars of the systemic racism is to keep us separated. And as long as we're separated, we'll never get a chance to really know and understand each other. And if we don't come together, then we're not going to trust one another. We're going to be suspicious. Now, I know that's not really answering your question, since we can't come together, until we get rid of this COVID business. But I think at the very least, our talking and engaging participants in our conversation is one of the best things that we can do. Because if we stop talking, we're going to slip back, and those people will say, well, it's not my problem. I got things to do. I got to take care, da, 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 da. And the selfishness of Americans will once again surface and be prominent. I think the selfishness that we have towards one another is really one of the things that separates us, because we don't want to take out time to listen. We don't want to take out time to talk to one another. As soon as we see that we're black or white or green or yellow, then the walls go up or something goes up and it doesn't work out well.
You bring up a really, really good point. That's the first thing. We just need to slow down and listen to each other. It's just as simple to start. If that's where you're at, that's where we begin. That's a really good place to begin, is just to take a deep breath and open yourself up to having Tiffany, you said this at one point. This is part of being in a brave space, that if you say something and you don't realize it's offensive, you stay open to the fact that you'll get a response from the other person that tells you that, and then you can respond back. And that's part of that brave space. I would love, Tiffany, for you to elaborate on what that means.
Yeah, two things. One, I think people need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? A part of a brave space is the acknowledgement of, hey, these conversations are not easy. They're not easy for me to have with white people, and they're not easy for white people to have with people of color. They're not easy. They are uncomfortable. And I think the first step to really being able to make any type of change is just acknowledging that and working through it. Now, the difference between a safe space and a brave space is this. A safe space allows for racist comments and people of color to not be welcomed in that space. It's a space where you use language that is offensive and you don't go back and clean it up, right? It's a safe space for white people. Whereas a brave space is a space where people of color can correct you when you say something wrong, and you get to go back and edit it, right? None of us are experts in this stuff. Like we haven't all come, like we don't have equity yet. So we don't, like, we're all striving to get that, right? We're all fighting for that. And so something like really to keep in mind is that we're all trying. We're all working on this and we have to work on it together. So being in a brave space means that you need to come into that space brave enough to be uncomfortable. Like you need to be brave and be uncomfortable because it's an uncomfortable conversation. And so in that space, you get corrected, and no, correction is not always easy. However, you don't offend people when you leave that space and you talk to the next person of color and the next one. Like we have to get used to being uncomfortable for a moment, because in the future, hopefully none of us will have to be uncomfortable. Hopefully we'll just be. But for now, this is kind of how it is.
Yeah, and being uncomfortable, I mean, that is it. Being comfortable, being uncomfortable, because everybody likes someone who can admit they're uncomfortable. Let's face it. Everybody feels really comfortable around someone who says, "Oh, my bad," because it takes the pressure off of them. I mean, there's no shame in it. There's no shame in anything we're doing here because we're all trying, as you said. Thank you so much, Tiffany. That's huge. Clinton.
Well, I know this is probably going to sound a little bit strange, but I am less concerned about, I don't know, this whole thing about going along to get along. I'm more concerned about the self-love that Black people demonstrate and self-respect that Black people demonstrate for themselves, because I think that is that's a starting point. My orientation under my father, who was a lawyer for Dr. King, in the first major campaign after Montgomery, which was Albany, Georgia, which is where I am now, was always, what's much more important than being liked is being respected. That's always much more key. And it was one of the things that he was a little bit uncomfortable on his deathbed with, this whole notion of what appeared to be this fight for quote unquote integration. And it brings up this whole notion of the difference between integration versus desegregation. And his argument essentially was this. This was not about holding the hands. This thing called the civil rights movement was not about holding the hands of white people. It was never about that. It was about the ability for you to basically follow your tax dollars wherever they were being spent. So if they were being spent on schools, irrespective of your skin color, you should be able to go to that. If they were being spent on libraries, you should be able to go to that place. Or swimming pools, public swimming pools. You should be able to go to those facilities. But what did America do? America basically made relevant what was irrelevant, which was skin color. And so the whole fight was basically to knock down that firewall, was to desegregate and get rid of that. Effectively, it was the same argument as those white young men in Boston Harbor, when they threw the tea in Boston Bay, in the Boston Harbor. It basically was, don't tax me without representing me. Don't tax me without basically serving me. And that's essentially what the argument ultimately of the Black community was, where concerned the civil rights movement. It kind of got muddled because everybody sat there and they saw the March on Washington. They heard, King say, Black kids and white kids holding hands together. They heard, former slaves and former slave owners sitting down at the table of brotherhood. But basically, at the end of the day, it's about self-respect. And so more than anything, I think that the self-respect piece is really where it all begins. And then people basically, to the extent that you love yourself and you respect yourself, I think that dictates how other people ultimately deal with you. And so it's far more important.
Glenn, that really folds nicely into a comment that I just read from an attendee where they said, I'm told Black people don't want to explain what we did wrong. And I'm assuming she's white, that the way the question was phrased. I do get that question a lot, and it spills out of what you're saying. And other people, when from a perspective of a Black person, when you're talking about self-respect and white people approaching people with this kind of conversation, and we are filled with this very apologetic, almost self-loathing or insecurity, and it puts, do you feel it flips around on you as a Black person to have to help us out and give us compassion, whereas we should actually come to the conversation with, look, I recognize what happened. I acknowledge what happened. I'm sorry about what happened. Where do we go from here? And you don't sit there and force you to be an emotional support to us when, can you help
No,
us?
I'm very lasered about this whole thing.
Yeah.
You had a look at the history of Martha's Vineyard. And my sensibility is there are lessons in its history where it concerns Black folk on that island and Black folk who summer on that island. And I think as well, there is also lessons for white people who either reside on that island or they summer as well. And what I mean by that is the name of Susan Bradley should be very clear to everybody if you don't know who she is. I'll deal with her in a minute. The name of Madison Edwards should be very familiar to everybody. You know, people sit there and they look at these Jamaicans who turn up and populate that island. It was a Jamaican at the end of the day who basically, after the enslaved Africans were there for many years, it was Madison Edwards who basically brought and encouraged Oscar Denniston to come over and to begin to work with the Black parishioners there on that island. And so the reality is I guess what I'm saying to you, Laurel, is that I think that history holds what I think has been modeled as good and responsible behavior. You know, Madison Edwards was out of Vineyard Haven. You should read his story. I mean, there's no magic to this. Just follow his example. He modeled his life in that way. He brought over Oscar Denniston, period. When you look at the person like this woman, Susan Bradley, again, Bradley came out of Stoughton. Again, she did important work for the Black community there. I mean, this is not rocket science, folks. Just look at the history books. You wrote them. We didn't write them. They're there.
So we're going back to history again. Knowing our history is really key here. And again, coming to the conversation with the intention of learning and being open-hearted, kind of casting off what we already know and coming almost as a knave, as a babe, to out of the woods that we have been in for so long, because information has been controlled over the years and through history. We all know that. And we know that we now need to come back and relearn. As Walter said earlier in the hour here, re-educate ourselves. Be open to just, wait a minute, I've only read half the book. All of this has been redacted. I got to get the copies and I've got to see what's been filling in the blanks here. So it's really, again, just take a deep breath as a white person and be brave to just say, hey, look, I've been living under a rock for a long time and I only understand part of this history, or I have these questions, and don't be afraid to ask them. And don't be afraid to get the response. So Pete, do you want to add something?
You read my mind. Thanks, Laurel. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about is, and this plays off of what Tiffany said and what Clinton just said, is we need to be courageous and we also need to be curious. And whether that's curious looking back at history or at the person that might be different than you, that you may have just offended or that you're worried about having a conversation with. We call it becoming a change agent, right? It's about the fact that all of us can say it's because of history, or we can rely on history to help us move this discussion forward in a way that's productive. One of the things that I grew up in a very white dominated part of Connecticut, was with an organization that was very male dominated and white. And when I've been on this journey, I was probably more of an avoider, hopefully not a perpetuator, but I needed to move to become a change agent, which means that you're not afraid to identify something that someone just said that's wrong and have a conversation about why it was said. And we can all blame it on, the people that came before us or the senior leadership in an organization or the rest of the world, but we all have responsibility, whether we're white, whether we're not white, to address this in a productive way that doesn't involve, personalities and conflict. my opinion.
Thank you, Pete. Michael?
I just wanted to add that if you're looking for practical or very specific ideas or suggestions, one that I would throw out there is that in our engagement, and this is a self-selected crowd, so but in general, I have found it very useful for me in engaging others on difficult topics, whether it's race or otherwise, is to accept other people's viewpoints, but not necessarily agree with them. The starting point for discussion, isn't the end point. And it may be even at the end of engagement, you don't always see eye to eye, but I think that there's real intrinsic value in the exercise of respectful engagement over a long, making it a habit of your life. And I think particularly on these difficult issues like race, keeping engaged with each other within boundaries of civility, and there are certain boundaries you just shouldn't and can't cross in hoping, so with goodwill and that the word that we use, intention, I think that accepting different perspectives, at least in the short run, and not having to always agree to measure it as a success or not.
Thank you, Michael. Sandy?
Yes. As I listen to people and I think about what works, I can look back on what I thought was a miracle that happened many years ago. And it was really, it was a small city near Detroit, where a group of people got to know each other. It was a very divided city. There had been all kinds of rioting, and there was a mechanism, and I don't have time to really go into it, but I think it shows the power of what people have alluded to. People got to know each other. People got to trust each other. And together, we were able to have these conversations that we wouldn't have had as easily before. And there was a great lesson in that for me. And since that time, this was maybe 30 years ago, I look back on my life and I realized the gifts that I've had in friendships and how meaningful my life has been. And those of us who were part of that initiative realized that together, that we had something pretty special and other people wanted to be part of it. And out of that change, out of those relationships came a lot of really wonderful change. So I think there's a lot in it for us individually. And I think if we're able to bridge those trusting bridges, that we will be able to do some really exciting things. And I always think of Martha's Vineyard as, I've lived here for 20 years, it's a miracle waiting to happen. We have good people who want to do things, and together, if we get to know each other, it doesn't get to be a comfortable or an uncomfortable conversation. It gets to be a conversation. And that's where we're hoping we can get to. So it's just a thought that as I'm listening to people, my old days come back to me, and I just thought I'd share that with.
Well, Sandy, that's a beautiful way, because we're coming to a close of our hour, and I've worked in some comments. We didn't have so many questions, but some comments from our listeners, or from our attendees. And the way you have just kind of summed everything up, I think that brings us to a beautiful crescendo here, and a good stopping point for us to continue for next week. What I believe we've established tonight is the importance of us knowing our history. We need to read more about our history. We need to dig a little deeper and past what is easily available to maybe things that are a little less available to us. We're going to continue to build our diversity library at mvyradio.org/diversity. That page will continue to grow. We are recording this, so if you want to listen again, or listen back, or share this with other family and friends, we'll have a link available soon. We'll post it on Facebook, or you can go just check our diversity page, and we'll get that up there soon. And we will continue this journey together of turning over stones, asking questions, learning about what needs to be done, and not being afraid to do it. Having that courageous kind of fire in the belly, let's rise to action right now and not just be complacent anymore. Now is the time for all of us to kind of get up and feel that discomfort and act on it. Let it, like, whenever if we're a stage actor, or if we're a sports person, we've anybody who has had to do something and they're right about to do it and they get nervous, those nerves are a good thing. They help us act, they help us behave in the way we need to behave to get something done. So if we can all just feel that fear and do it anyway, as that book title says, and we can just rely on each other to say, hey, listen, that probably wasn't a good idea, but this is probably a better way to handle it. And just trust everybody around us to help guide us and come in with the right intent. I think we're gonna get through. We're gonna get it. We're gonna do it. So as I want to thank the panel again. I want to thank Pete Ambrositis, sorry. Peter Leroy Ambrositis, Dr. Walter Collier, Sandy Pimentel, thank you so much. Michael McCullough. Again, I want to say, I just read Michael McCullough's book, No Truth Left to Tell. If you want a book that you will literally finish in one night because you won't be able to put it down, it tells an incredible tale, and the characters, his character development in these it really brings in a lot of what we're talking about tonight. And it was a brave book. It was a beautiful book. So Michael, thank you for writing that book, and thank you for being part of the panel. Tiffany, your energy just fills my soul with such joy. And Clennon, I love the energy you bring to the discussion, because it is exactly what we need. I treasure all of you, and I thank you all for your voice tonight. And to bring us all into the room again and end on a really positive, joyful note, Tiffany, way back at the beginning of all this, said, there's so much talk out there about the bad things and the violence and all the things that are horrible about having Black skin. But then there's this joyful side of having Black skin and living in the world that they've adapted out of their tragedies and all of the atrocities. And it's another aspect of the culture that we need, and the experience that we need to treasure, that we need to feel. So Tiffany, thank you for connecting us with this video. I am indebted to you. And Jess is going to play the video for us right now as we just soak it all in. And I hope that you will join us next Monday at 5 o'clock for our continuing discussion on race equity. I'm Laurel Redington. Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting this nonprofit, listener-supported radio station. You're all amazing for being here. And I'm grateful to the entire MVY radio team for making it happen too. And AHA New Bedford for underwriting support. Take it away.
Black joy.
Black joy.
Black joy is hallelujah.
Black joy is embedded in me.
Is infectious.
Black joy is unapologetic.
Black joy is revolutionary.
Black joy is magic.
Black joy is beautiful.
Black joy is indestructible.
Black joy is freedom.
Freedom
is resilience.
Black joy is my joy.
Black joy is essential.
Black joy is sexy and real.
Black joy matters.
Well, amen, and have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you.
We'll put up a slide now that will put the website in your brain. And if you have any questions that you want to email me directly, I can see if it's laurel@mvyradio.org. Send them away and we'll try to answer them for you if we can.